It is a real pleasure for me today to have Stijn Broecke, who is a senior economist at the OECD in Paris. And I'm talking to him from my flat in Manhattan, New York, and he's talking to me from his flat in right near Saint-Germain-en-Laye, just outside Paris. Stijn, good afternoon. Thanks for being with me.
Hello, and thanks for having me.
We're going to talk about automation, about which Stijn is a real expert. Let me just fire questions at you, get your answers, and go back and forth. So, again, a short historical perspective on automation. What jobs have been those which have been automated out of existence in the past decade?
So I think this is actually a very difficult question to answer, and I think it's a difficult question to answer empirically, because empirically I think it's difficult to link the adoption of automation technologies directly to the destruction of certain jobs. And that's partly because we have relatively poor measures of the adoption of automating technologies. So mostly what we're able to do is to link very general measures of technology adoption, so at a very aggregate level, to general labor market outcomes. But that obviously doesn't prove any causation. Even if you find that in certain sectors, certain regions, technology adoption leads to poor employment outcomes, there could be lots of other things going on as well. So for instance, we know there's globalization and offshoring, and those can also lead to job destruction. And those could be confounding factors, and it's very difficult to disentangle them empirically. So one of the things we have done at the OECD is we have tried to look a couple of years back at what occupations could in theory be automated. And so this was based on the work by Frey and Osborne. But one difference is that where they took a dichotomous approach, so they looked at which jobs could be automated, yes or no. What we did is we followed a task-based approach. So we looked at what tasks could be automated. So basically parts of jobs could be automated rather than the entire job. And what this research suggested is that in OECD countries on average, about 14% of jobs were at high risk of automation. And this would be, say, within the next 10 to 20 years.
Let me ask you that 14% seems to me, given, again, obviously automation is a very sort of mushy concept. 14% seems rather low, I would say.
Yeah.
Am I missing something, or is that a reasonable way of thinking about it?
Yes and no. Let me make 2 points here. One, it may even actually seem quite high on the one hand, because it's not because a job is theoretically automatable that it actually will be automated. So this is a theoretical estimate, right? It's what's technically possible. So we know that one of the critical bits will be whether a firm thinks it's valuable, whether a firm will make a profit out of investing in such technologies as opposed to using labor. So that's one thing you need to remember. But I think you're right on the other hand as well, that, and this is what our estimates show as well, the 14% applies to jobs at high risk of automation. So this is where we think more than 70% of the tasks could be automated.
Okay.
But on top of that, we think another third of jobs, so this gets you together with the high risk of automation nearer to 50%. Another third of jobs are jobs where you have a significant or a risk of significant change. So this is where between 50 to 70% of tasks could change as a result of automation. So these are not necessarily jobs that will disappear. These are jobs basically where you will see significant change. And I think this is partly what our work shows, is that we may not necessarily, or should not necessarily be worried about jobs disappearing, but what we will see is significant change. So it's not that jobs will disappear, it's that jobs will change significantly. And in fact, I'm aware, you may be aware of the research by Dessen, where he's actually tried to answer this question, and he only found one occupation since 1950 that has entirely disappeared. So coming back to your original question, the only occupation that he found had been eliminated was elevator operators. But But apart from that, most occupations still exist. It's just that the nature of tasks has changed within so the nature of the jobs has changed. Now,
Okay, that's very interesting. Can you give me an example of a very high risk of one of those jobs where it's 70% or more, another one which is in the slightly lower range? Can you give me one specific example of those?
yes, so we tend to find that the jobs that were at highest risk of automation were jobs in manufacturing. These were often jobs where the tasks that people did were routine tasks, so the kind of tasks that you can program. Whereas jobs that had a low risk of automation is where basically human skills were very important still, and skills which were not routine, soft skills. So one example of that would be jobs in the healthcare sector. Many of those jobs require interpersonal skills, which are very difficult to automate at this stage.
Okay. Let me go on to another question then. Again, you said that it's hard to identify people who specifically have lost their jobs to automation, but not using elevator operators as an example, because that's really quite unique. I've seen elevator operators. I'm old enough to remember what they do, but people your age wouldn't know one if they fell over it. But what happens to people who do lose their jobs where the job loss might be attributable to automation, even though I realize it's very hard to measure that? What do
Right.
they
So
do?
as you point out, it's very hard to actually measure this because what you need is you need to be able to, yeah, you need data which traces people over time. But not only
Yeah.
that, you need to know that the job loss was related to automation. So these are data which are very difficult to obtain. But what we try to do is we try to look at what happened to middle or workers who used to do middle skill jobs. So you may be familiar with the whole job polarization story. So we know that since the mid 90s, the share of employment in middle skill occupations, so these are truck drivers, machine operators, but also people like cashiers, secretaries, the share of those jobs declined by 11 percentage points on average in OECD countries, right? So we took this as the starting point. Now, I must stress something. It's not that the number of those jobs has declined necessarily, it's their share has declined. And I think that's a very important point to make. So their relative weight in total employment has declined relative to other occupations. So there's fewer opportunities in these jobs. So the question we try to ask is, what happens to the typical worker who would have done those types of jobs, right? You have a profile of a worker in a middle skilled occupation. What has happened to you now? What do these people do now compared to 10, 20 years ago? And there's two mechanisms that could be at play here. One, it could be in those occupations that people are less likely to enter those occupations than previously, or it could be that people are more likely to leave those occupations than previously, right? And this is not just an academic exercise, it's one that's really important for policy as well, because if it is that people are leaving those occupations, you need to focus policy on where the transitions happen. So on policies and measures that accompany workers making transitions, so social protection, retraining, etc. If the mechanism is people not entering those occupations, your focus needs to be on initial education. So what we actually found is, of course, both of these mechanisms are at play, but what we actually found is that the main mechanism is people not entering these occupations at the same rate as 10, 20 years ago. Now, what is, in most countries, we also find that, so the question now is then, what happens to middle skilled workers more generally? Where do we find them now? Because even though they might not be entering these occupations anymore, the question is, what are they doing instead, right? And what we find is that these people tend to be pushed down in a distribution. And so they tend to be competing increasingly with workers at low skill end.
In other words, they don't get the skills to put themselves into the higher category.
No, and I guess this is another important point to make. In most countries, Of course, there's always some middle-skilled workers who used to be in high-skilled occupations. But in most countries, that has declined over time. So fewer and fewer middle-skilled workers are in high-skill occupations. But there's a few exceptions to that, interestingly. Sweden, Germany, Norway, Denmark. In those countries, we've seen a rise in the share of middle-educated workers employed in high-skilled occupations. Now, of course, we don't know entirely why that is, but it may not be, it may not be entirely by chance that these are countries that have a strong emphasis on vocational education and training, countries also where there's generally a strong history of good labor relations.
Okay, well, that's very encouraging, but the problem, of course, is everything I talk about with people, they point to Scandinavia and Germany as being the paragons. And I really mean, we all know what they do, but we certainly, in countries like the U.S., France, or England, have not quite been able to carry those models over here. Let me ask you a different question, okay? This is pure speculation. What do you think the jobs or occupations are that are most at risk? You've made a list of them that are the 70%. Can you give me a couple of jobs that are highly at risk of being phased out because of automation over the next decade or so?
So many jobs in manufacturing, also in agriculture, are very
agriculture.
Very
we already have almost nobody working in agriculture. How can we go much lower? Okay.
We still can. Also, we mustn't forget service jobs. I think there are some retail jobs and logistics jobs, for instance, which are at very high risk of being automated as well. I think in general, I mean, going back to agriculture, manufacturing, it's low-skilled people who are at highest risk of automation. When you look at occupations with a very low risk of automation, they pretty much all require some professional training or even tertiary education. And so these are occupations like teaching, management professions, also health professions, as I mentioned earlier. There's also, I think, certain groups who are more risk of automation than others. And this may surprise you, but one of these groups is young people. And we believe that this is because there are many entry-level jobs that are gradually disappearing, gradually being automated. Think about the legal profession. There are many tasks in the legal profession that young people who have just graduated would start doing, and now these tasks have disappeared because they've been automated. Now, I think it's time, and we're about to do it, I think it's time that we need to revise these estimates, because we've done those a few years ago, and even in just a span of a few years, there's been massive leaps in technology. And one particular technology I'm thinking about is artificial intelligence. It's becoming more and more a general purpose technology. And what we see from the literature so far on this, and this is a very small literature so far, but what we see is that the occupations most affected by artificial intelligence tend to be high-skilled occupations.
Like legal research, for example?
Yes, or in the medical profession, but also engineers. But the interesting thing about this is it's not necessarily, when I say they're most affected by artificial intelligence, that doesn't mean necessarily that they're at high risk of being automated. What we also tend to see is that those technologies tend to be complementing these workers in these jobs. And I think the risk now going forward is that we get high-skilled workers who become even more productive in the future, and their wages will increase even further relative to low-wage workers and low-skilled workers, and we might get further increases in inequality, but for different reasons.
See, we usually think about inequality rising because guys are shoved out of the middle down to the lower end. I had not thought about the opposite side of the coin, namely because of the technology being complementary with high skill, their wages go up even more. This is a double whammy, really, because of automation.
Right.
Let me ask you a final question. Look, as you know, other than the presidential election in America, all people care about right now is the pandemic. And that's true in France, where things are getting bad again. It's true in the US, which is, at this point, I think, other than Belgium, among European countries, and San Marino, which doesn't count, the US now has killed off more people per capita than any European country, a rather disgusting record. How is this going to affect automation over the next year or 5 years even?
Hmm. Yeah, so this is an area where I'm going to have to speculate.
Of course.
But I think there are at least three reasons to believe that companies will increasingly be attracted to investing in automation. And so we may see a trend that we expected to happen in the next 10 to 20 years happen in a shorter time span. And the three reasons are the following. First of all, COVID-19 disrupted global supply chains. And so this may have led to an increased desire to reshore production from countries with lower wage costs back home, closer to consumers. That doesn't mean we're going to create jobs back home, because those may be fully automated factories. But that is one reason why I think we may see increased automation. The second reason is that companies may wish to reduce human-to-human contact. I mean, we've seen this with the pandemic, social distancing rules. It made it very difficult for many firms to continue producing as normal. And so replacing humans with robots would allow firms to just overcome these challenges.
Good point.
And the third reason is very simple. Robots don't get sick. So that will be another, I think, very important reason why companies may now be looking to invest in those technologies. So all in all, I think COVID-19 may have accelerated this pre-existing trend towards greater automation. Now, of course, again, I'm speculating here. We are only just beginning to develop measures of the adoption of some of these technologies, for instance, AI. I'd be very interested to see in the months and years that come whether my predictions will have come true. We'll see, but we certainly saw this in the previous crisis as well, is that crises tend to have a kind of accelerating effect on pre-existing trends. We saw it with polarization in the previous crisis and the destruction of manufacturing jobs, and we may well see a greater move towards automation now as well.
It's funny, as a labor economist who spent part of his career working on labor demand, my thought was with high unemployment, keep the people there because wage costs will not rise very fast. On the other hand, the points you make are very, very sensible and a little bit scary in the sense that this sounds like something that will tend toward increasing inequality more rapidly than we even might have thought. Fascinating. Well, anyway, Stijn, thank you very much for being with me today. I learned something, which I don't always learn from these things, and I'm even more depressed now than I was before I talked to you. Thanks very much.
It was my pleasure, and trust me, I'm an optimist on these things. I think with the right policies, the right institutions, we can get to a better place than where we are right now.
I hope you're right. Thanks again.
Thank you.